And thank you everyone for joining us today. We're very fortunate to have two people with us that are very expert, have good histories and good experiences in trying to understand regulation, and then that gives them a kind of a leg up, if you will, on how do we deal with regulatory issues during pandemics. I'm well acquainted with both of them. Our first person is Dr. Roxana Barrantes. She's a professor of economics at Pontifica Catholic University of Peru. Known Roxana for about 20 years. I think you must have been 15 when we met then, Roxana. She was at OSIPTEL at the time, just helping form the regulatory agency there at Peru, and has served in several positions in government senior level positions since then. Jeff Eisenach I've known for a shorter period of time. He and I are both visiting scholars at the American Enterprise Institute. He began his careers in public policy back in the Reagan administration, has served in several places in government since then, and he's now the managing director and co-chair of NERA's Communications, Media, and Internet practice. So both of you, thank you for being here. Now I'm just going to jump right into it so that we make good use of everyone's time. And I'm going to ask both of you to address all the questions I asked, but Roxana, I'm going to start with you. Here's the first question. In the previous discussions I've had with you, you've observed that as you watch how regulators are responding with the coronavirus, the pandemic, that they focused on consumers, and that's where people start and then things work out from there. Describe what you've seen and how you understand it, please.
First, thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation, and thanks for those of you sharing this time of the day to be able to talk about those challenges that we are facing right now. Regarding Mark's Jay's question, what we are seeing in this pandemic, in which the internet access to ICTs is so important in order for people to be connected to different things that they want to do, even work, is that regulators are focusing on actual consumers. How to make the life of actual consumers easier means allowing to postpone payments, allowing certain quality technical repairs, but potential consumers, people not yet subscribed to network, are being overlooked. This might be a worse problem in less developed countries, in which, given fraud and other kind of illegal activities in the past, when you want to sign up for service, you need to show up at a particular location and show your national identification card. And now that we are in lockdown and you cannot do that, life is really difficult for people who want to subscribe to services or upgrade services, current services, and being able to do that, which are very much needed in the current situation.
All right, well, thank you. So Jeff, let me turn to you now. NERA has done extensive research on how regulators are responding around the world. Could you describe that a little bit, please, and what your takeaways are from that?
Sure. So first of all, thank you, Mark, for organizing this, and to PUCP. You and I have known each other for some time, and I know the great work that you do with PUCP. I know you mostly through affiliation with the American Enterprise Institute and transition team and so forth, but it's great to be able to participate in this, and thank you for the opportunity. So NERA is a global economic consulting firm with a pretty significant telecoms practice around the world, and some of my colleagues prepared a summary of some of the things that they're seeing regulators do and some of the impacts on networks. And just to summarize things that probably most people know, first of all, clearly the crisis has had a tremendous impact on the way networks are being used. Obviously in business applications, fixed networks in areas where, downtown areas where businesses are closed, traffic is down, residential demand is up dramatically. Mobile demand is down in the sense that it's reflecting less mobility, but people are still using their smartphones. They're using them more over Wi-Fi networks and less over the mobile network, but still the impact on total traffic is significant, is still up. And part of that is also a shift from broadband to voice and messaging. So there's a lot of people making a lot more phone calls today than a month ago. So those are some of the changes that we're seeing. In terms of the regulatory responses, four kind of that we've identified categories of responses. The first is, as Roxana said, lots of efforts to cushion the blow for consumers. So in the United States, Ajit Pai, the chairman of the FCC, very early announced a Keep Americans Connected pledge, and that was simply a pledge to not be cutting people off for non-payment during the course of the crisis. Other steps to, for example, expand universal service programs to make sure that people are eligible for lifeline support to the extent that they need it. So that's the consumer part. The second category, and this has been done not just in the US, but in several countries around the world, Ireland, India, and elsewhere, where regulators have granted temporary spectrum licenses. So in the US, for example, the FCC has more than doubled T-Mobile's access to 600 megahertz spectrum in order to allow it to carry to meet the shifting burden and the network congestion that's associated with the shifting burden of mobile network usage. So the granting of temporary spectrum licenses. Thirdly, removing regulatory barriers, and really the one that's gotten the most notice is that in countries which are experiencing network overload, congestion issues associated with the increased traffic and the shifting traffic patterns, in the European Union is one of those, where they've relaxed net neutrality rules. And specifically asked, in fact, online video providers like Netflix to reduce the quality, at least at peak hours, that they're offering to consumers, to offer a standard definition instead of a high definition signal, at least during the peak hours. And then lastly, and I think this is not in any way unique to the telecoms world, but government activities in general are being postponed or delayed. So whether it's in the litigation front, the merger review front, or the spectrum auction front, we've seen all of those pushed back, and presumably those pushbacks will continue until we get some kind of resolution and the ability to engage in travel-related activities, for example. So that's what we're seeing. I think the two takeaways, first of all, I think this has really brought home the significance, the importance of robust, redundant telecom infrastructures and the importance of network investment, the ability to have a network in place that can respond to these shifting demands and is robust to that. And I think the US has come out looking pretty good on that front. And then secondly, I think there are some examples, they may be few and far between, where we're seeing what I guess I'd refer to as regulatory opportunism, the opportunity, people seeing an opportunity. I think we were joking yesterday, it was, I think, Winston Churchill who said, never let a good crisis go to waste. There are some places around the world, again, I think they may be isolated episodes where regulators are saying, seeing an opportunity, or regulated interests are seeing an opportunity to pursue agendas that they might not otherwise be able to get done in normal times. Another thing I think we'll end up talking about at some point, and I'll stop with this, is just to tease it. Obviously, there are big privacy implications for a lot of what's happening in terms of the response. I'll stop there.
Okay, well, we'll get to that topic, the privacy, and we'll get to the opportunism topic later. Let me ask you, Jeff, my next question, and that is, when the regulators are changing their approaches during this time, there's going to be questions come up of, well, should this just be a permanent change? What have you seen as people thinking about that this is just temporary, maybe this should be permanent? How do you see people thinking about that, and what are your thoughts on how regulators should do that?
Well, I guess I'd separate it out in a sense. I think the we are living in a time of unprecedented uncertainty, battling an epidemic that we don't understand very well, and we don't know where it's going. People can say, well, this was anticipated by this person or that person. Bill Gates gave a speech or so forth. But the reality is nobody could have anticipated precisely this or its consequences. And so we're all reacting in real time. And I think what would be important is not so much to try to sort out the permanent from the temporary as we're in the midst of the crisis. I think it probably is important to keep a list of all of the temporary things that we're doing and go back and do an active review of those. And maybe the answer is sort of an implicit sunset provision. If you weren't doing it before, maybe you shouldn't be doing it after either. And the burden of proof ought to be, was this a change that really makes good public policy sense? Now I do think some things pass that. And so, coming back to one of the themes here, I think, which is the importance of supporting infrastructure investment, and really it's not a national security so much as it is a public security asset that the telecom network has shown itself to be in a way that we didn't really think about so much. I think that really does kind of emphasize the importance of network investment, redundancy, vibrancy in the network infrastructure, and that might be a set of changes that people want to come back and look at after the fact in terms of where we go from here.
Okay, well, let's come back to that as well, because that's an issue that just keeps showing up regardless of the sector that we speak with. Roxana, what are your thoughts on this? We've taken some actions in this emergency. Do we hang on to them? Do we let them go? Maybe we put on sunsets, as Jeff was talking about. What are your thoughts?
I think the answer to that question depends a lot on the institutional context. For instance, in Europe and the US, you have like a tradition of making sense of trying to make sense of the regulations and justify them before the public, and even do some regulatory impact analysis, some serious regulatory impact analysis. But in less developed countries, this is not the norm. And sometimes you want to do something, but the powers that are there that are not institutionalized prevent you from doing a welfare enhancing, enacting a welfare enhancing regulation. And so the crisis is an opportunity for the ministry, the regulator to make that change that otherwise they couldn't do it. Mm-hmm. And so that is one aspect that should be taken into consideration. The other aspect, at least from the experience in Peru, anything that you enact for on a temporary basis turns out to be permanent, because you create stakeholders. Those stakeholders will do their job when the regulation is going to be changed or phased out. And so it is really, as Jeff said, a period of uncertainty. You don't know what to do. You don't know what the medium term is. And maybe some regulators will see that this is an opportunity to enact the changes that they couldn't for 25 or 20 years. Mm-hmm. So it's going to be really interesting to listen to our audience. What are they seeing in their own countries or territories?
So Roxana, what's your advice on that? If you're the regulator and you're afraid that the operators are being opportunistic, they're just taking advantage of the situation to get something they've always wanted, it's not necessarily germane to the current situation, but they push it anyway. Or if you're the consumer, or if you're the operators, and you concern that the government is behaving that way, or the regulators behaving opportunistically, how do you oppose that? Because right now that's an emergency, and people do all kinds of things in emergencies.
Exactly. Maybe the answer that I'm going to give to the question is, it's going to generate some discussion, and that will be interesting. But in this kind of situation, which is a health-related shock, in which the human well-being is in question, maybe I will go for any change that pursues the ability of people to live in a healthy environment. Mm-hmm. That will be like the marking that I will do. Will this is this consistent with people today's well-being? Are we keeping people's well-being today with this change in regulation? That might be my answer to that question. Okay. Further discussion, because it's so tough.
So it sounded like you would have some standards that says it has to deal with the health issues, it has to deal with the immediate economic issues. Otherwise, you're not going to think it's really central to the moment that we find ourselves in. Perhaps I should have you talk with the U.S. Congress about that, but that's a whole nother topic. So Jeff, what are your thoughts on this? The opportunistic behavior on part of industry and a part of the government. How do we combat that? Do we not? How does that all play out in your mind?
Well, I think I guess I do think we've hit on the right principles here. I think the first one is, if there's not a very tight nexus to some public health, safety, or immediate economic effect associated with the crisis, is probably not a good time to be making a big change. And then secondly, I do think a presumption, and I think Roxana's point is very well taken, which is temporary things tend to become permanent very quickly, largely because they do develop a constituency. It's harder to take them away. But to the extent things can be made explicitly temporary, I think that's also a good idea in general. And I think some good regulatory changes will be made, could be made, and some ones that I would think that in my eyes would be less favorable. But I'd be willing to give up the permanence of the good ones in order to avoid the permanence of bad ones. So it'll be time for thoughtful consideration of general policy changes later. And I think the potential for mistakes here, we're in a high beta environment, I guess they'd say, in the stock market. And when that happens, you're dealing with lots of uncertainty, and policy mistakes are going to get made. And what you don't want to do is lock it in life.
All right. So let me go back to an issue that you raised, Jeff, and that is the issue of privacy. Because we are in a moment where governments, operators are taking greater liberty with data than they might in other times, just to try and track what is happening, where are people moving around to try and deal with health issues. Do you think that is, I'll ask you first, Jeff, is that something that maybe becomes permanent, or do you think it's important to try to unwind that at some point in the near future?
I think there's sort of a larger set of sociological, cultural implications, longer run changes that will come out of this virus, which I think people are only now sort of trying to, I think it's way too early for people to fully understand. And the privacy issue is one I put in that category of big changes. How will people think about nation states? How will people think about the role of government, how people think about communitarianism versus libertarianism. You know, all those things are kind of in play when you've got a cultural event of this magnitude. On the privacy front, I think the only thing I'm feel comfortable predicting is that it will accelerate the debate. So the ubiquitousness of observation and the recording of that observation, the archiving of it, the information about the fact that information is collected about pretty much every aspect of our lives now. If you're carrying a cell phone, carrying a smartphone, your network operator and your apps providers have a very good idea of where you are and what you're doing. That information, you know, up until now, in most Western countries anyway, has been, you know, kept in a computer vault and eventually erased and available to government only under very limited circumstances. It varies a lot by country and by circumstance. The whole kind of very public battle between Apple and the United States government over when and under what circumstances an iPhone can be unlocked in criminal investigation or otherwise is one of the high profile instances in which that's come up. But that is a good example in the sense of the larger question. How do you balance the benefits of this ubiquitous omniscience that's in the network, the benefits of the use of that against the social costs of the use of that, and how do we even think about that? The benefits here, the ability to track and really to track with a lot of sophistication. I think the Apple Google app that's now becoming available has the capacity to literally identify if it's told someone is diagnosed with coronavirus. It can literally identify everybody who's been within 6 feet of that person for the last month. You know, that information is potentially, you know, extremely useful in terms of fighting the virus, also potentially very impactful in a whole lot of ways having to do with employment and so on that really affects civil rights issues. So I could go on for a long time about this, obviously, but the only thing I think it's easy to predict here is that the conversation about how to strike that balance is going to be dramatically accelerated by this. We are now in the midst of, you know, facing that full force in a way that up until now it's been easier to kind of shuffle into the shuffle aside. So I think we're going to have a debate about that in different countries. Obviously, you know, the answer to that question in China will be very different from the answer, I hope, to that question in the United States.
Yeah, well, thank you. And I just remind the audience, I've now consumed the amount of time that I'd committed to myself to asking questions of Jeff and Roxana. So please put your questions in the chat, send them to everyone, and I will work them into our discussion. Until I see some of those, Roxana, I would just ask basically that similar question to you. It surprised me, just as a little bit more context. There was a paper released out of our National Bureau of Economic Research in the US just in the past 2 or 3 days that was using cell phone data to measure how well people were actually staying at home under the different lockdowns. And I thought that was fascinating that they could get that data and use it for public research. They said they couldn't identify individuals, but they knew whether or not you were at home. So that's pretty darn close. How does this play out in Peru or any other countries that you're looking at?
Hey, actually, we have the app. I downloaded it, and it has like a triage, several questions that you can answer, and it will alert me in case somebody reading Spanish. No, it's in case somebody close by gets a positive, and it also shows a map of all the people around me and around the people I know, I love, on like a Google map kind of app. And so I know like 3 blocks from my house, there are some confirmed cases. I don't know who they are, but I can absolutely tell from the app. And the app is like I'm not sure it's visible, but it's really amazing. On the one hand, you feel safe. On the other hand, you think about a country that is really authoritarian, which is Peru. We elect our officials, government officials, but the country is intrinsically, you know, people are expecting somebody to tell them what to do, instead of just getting the self-discipline to do the things that are correct, right, just paying attention to the instructions. And so nobody, there is like two people in the country who are asking the questions Jeff was asking. So who will destroy this data? Who is responsible for the privacy of this data? And it's really amazing because the data is here. The authority, this is a government run app. The authorities have it, but I'm not sure they are using it for public health purposes. Mm-hmm. And so, and again, and it all depends on the institution in the country. The telecom regulator in Peru is not in charge of data privacy issues. So maybe in other countries they are. And so they will have something to say about this. And so I think it's an open question. And so absolutely agree with Jeff's point. There will be discussion, and I hope the discussion will come down even to less developed countries, in which those issues are not really what we care most about.
Okay, all right, thank you. So let me jump to questions being asked by our participants. The first is from Brian Carter. He talks about the telehealth program that the Federal Communications Commission here in the US has, and they've been awarded some additional dollars from Congress to provide for healthcare, rural healthcare, et cetera. He's asking, are there similar programs outside the US? Is a regulator or someone else helping subsidize healthcare in telecommunications for this event? Jeff or Roxana, either one of you, if you're familiar with anything like this.
Well, the Ministry of Health in Peru, like 10 years ago, they started a telehealth program. It was really limited, but it has like nothing to do with the telecom regulator. It is an issue of the Ministry of Health.
Okay.
The answer is I don't have a lot of insight into that one.
Okay. All right, appreciate it. So next question then comes from Kathleen Rivera. She's asking the question about governments increasing fees for telecom companies. There's a friction where the government is suffering from its budget dropping or its revenues dropping. The telecom operator is suffering from its revenues dropping. How do they sort that out? What have you seen of the governments going to the telecom operators to get additional money? Let's just start with that. Jeff or Roxana, either one?
Here in Peru, we are one of the few less developed countries with a strong fiscal position. So out of several sources, we are facing all the needed money to support people's income and food demand out of those funds. But yesterday, 1 month into the lockdown, I heard one big economist saying that, well, there is FITEL, the telecom fund, and its money may be used for purposes different than telecom expansion. On the other hand, it is maybe Jeff, you can expand on this. Mark, I'm jumping into your position, but at least in Latin America and in Peru in particular, telecom, since we had strong competition in the last 3-4 years, the the operators' financial position is are weak.
Mm-hmm.
And so this crisis is getting into weaker firms, facing weaker firms. And so I don't know what is going on in the US or other countries regarding that issue.
Jeff,
what are you seeing?
Well, I have heard, as I mentioned, kind of anecdotal reports of regulators in some countries taking an opportunity to increase fees. That hasn't happened in the United States, and really to the contrary. The United States government, including the Federal Communications Commission, has sought to ensure the liquidity of everybody, from small businesses, restaurants, individuals, all the way up through airlines and airplane manufacturers. On the telecom front, our providers, now there are 3 major mobile providers in particular, are financially robust. Verizon, in fact, is going forward with its planned, I think, $18 billion capex budget for 2020. I think we recently just said they were going to expand that a little bit. So we're not seeing financial hardship among our larger carriers. Among our smaller carriers, the FCC has reached out with the Universal Service Fund to make sure that those carriers have the liquidity that they need to continue operating. So we've really kind of gone in the other direction. And that might be, in a way, the right thing to do. Whatever issues sovereign states are having in terms of financing their continuing operations, regulatory fees that fall on private sector companies, particularly weaker ones in developing countries, have the risk of being fatal and causing lots of disruption. So what you don't want to do is take a telecom sector that may already be experiencing financial hardship or having difficulty kind of making the going forward investments that need to be made, and pile insult onto injury by adding fees.
All right, well, we'll have a whole nother program on that issue of well, actually we have more than one, on the issue of the financial impacts on the telecom companies, what that's going to mean for investment, future industry structure. But we'll bring you guys back to talk about some more of that, because that's a huge issue that a lot of countries are worried about. Let me go on. I'm going to run out of time here, but let me go on. We have one question about security related to regulatory issues, regulatory intervention. I guess there's a lot of ways of thinking about security, or a lot of aspects of security, but I know, Jeff, you mentioned it before. Why don't you elaborate a little bit more on what you said, and Roxana, then I'll turn to you and see what you might want to add.
Well, just very briefly, we have, one of the great geopolitical struggles going on in the world today among major powers is the struggle between between China and the United States over the future of 5G. And that is an issue which has caught the attention of everyone from presidents and premiers on down, because it is a security issue at the end of the day. And the world into which we are moving, 5G technologies will be embedded in virtually every mechanical device, and the ability to control everything from oil pipelines and natural gas pipelines to electricity grids and so forth, drones and airplanes, all of those things will operate using 5G technology. So the importance, I think, what I think this crisis, calls to light is both the security aspects of that, but as I said earlier, the public security aspects of that, the ability to have a robust, versatile, redundant, advanced infrastructure that can support all of the needs that we're seeing. So if you have to put up, for example, a hospital in Central Park, which we have in the United States, how do you provide the connectivity to make that happen? Well, you do that using advanced mobile broadband technology. In the future, that's 5G. So I think at the end of the day, health security, public security, national security, all of these things depend, and it's more and more evident on this robust, on infrastructure investment, at the end of the day, on infrastructure investment.
Good. Roxana, what are your thoughts on security issues?
Well, I totally agree with Jeff's reflection, but I have to add, no, from the developing world, we are just bystanders. We are just looking at how these Goliaths are fighting over a critical issue. And one thing that should be said, because of the national strategy of China, Huawei has entered all our markets,
Yeah.
and it is really strongly positioned right now, no? As opposed to Apple. Apple is like the upper classes are the ones using Apple. And so the fight is Samsung and Huawei. And so maybe the US, which used to have a pretty strong influence in Latin America, is losing it to China. I'm stepping out the boundaries
That's
of
okay.
the list I know.
That's all right. All right. Thank you. I appreciate it. It's a difficult issue to know a lot about. I was on a panel a while back to talk about that, and I felt completely ignorant compared to the rest of the panelists. So I understand it gets involved. So we have another question about the special provisions that are being made for people to be able to connect to the networks, pay lower fees or no fees or no connection fees whatsoever. And how do we transition out of that? Because at some point, the services need to be financially viable. How do you think about those transitions out? Maybe that's just the sunset, or is there anything additional to say there? Let's start with Jeff.
All right, so are we talking about at the operator level or the consumer level? Maybe.
This would be the fees paid by the consumer to the operator, being waived at this moment in time. That's happening in a lot of countries. Or then just how do you step out of that if that's where you've started with these consumers?
Well, I think I think there will be political pressures to keep some of those things in place, and we may well see. I think it's hard to predict, but I think we may well see, as again part of the broader impact of this crisis, an effort to kind of broaden and deepen the social safety net in lots of different ways. So there are a lot of things happening in the United States, for example, with respect to paying for everything from testing to care. And so insurance companies, for example, have waived co-insurance payments for anyone needing COVID-19 treatment in the hospital. And so that, and of course, we're sending out checks. We're mailing this week, billions, hundreds of billions of dollars in money to people. There will be pressures to keep all of those things on, and frankly, I guess my view would be, to the extent that's something that happens on the margin, the kind of the expansion of the social safety net is something that's been a long run phenomenon. As countries get richer, social insurance becomes more abundant. So if that happens on the margins, I think that's one thing. I do think the risk is that it's done in such a way which either that it harms the capitalist private sector economy, so that if it gets to the point where it reduces the flow of funds or the financial viability or the incentives to compete, then I think it would have structural harms that you want to avoid.
Okay. So Roxana, your thoughts?
I think there might be, firstly, it's like a long-term issue right now, because we don't know when will we be facing the issue of phasing out and redefining the new normal and living through the new normal. That's one issue. The second thing is that maybe there will be pressures to lower tariffs, and going back to regulators to justify their policy of relying on competition. And the third thing that I think should be said and discussed is that the internet and using the internet might become a service that will demand some kind of support in order to get like 100% of the population into the internet. In Peru, like 2 years ago, only 70% of the population used it. And so when you think going into the pandemic that demands that people refrain from social interaction, and then you need the internet, and you have like 1/4 of the population who cannot access it, don't know how to use it, don't know, etc. There is a major issue to address regarding social policies and inclusion policies, and maybe a new right to a service to get access to the internet. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you. So for those that are interested in more on that topic, that has come up in many instances, regardless of the sector, during our next session live programs that we have, next practice live sessions that we have. So if you look at the very first one, David Cox with Cable and Wireless in St. Lucia, he was talking about they're just connecting people for free, but they're time limiting that. You'll see that issue addressed by the CEO of Manila Water, how they're dealing with it in water, Peter Swege and with Umeme in Uganda. So all the countries that we're talking with are dealing with that particular issue. So you can find some good examples in some of our past webinars. Johannes Bauer, one of our friends up at Michigan State University, asks about information. So this is important for benchmarking, understanding what's going on in other countries. What are some good sources of information for how telecommunications traffic patterns have changed, where we see stresses, where we don't see stresses? Where can a person get good data to understand what's going on out there? Jeff, let me start with you.
Well, I think, Mark, we talked about the fact that my team, or the group that I'm part of at NERA, has done some of that research, and I think we have a client alert that Rebecca's going to be making available to all the participants on this call tomorrow that will have, some of those sources. I think the usual sources for network traffic information are the places that people are going. And I'm blanking at the moment on the specific names, but they're all the ones we're familiar with in terms of measuring internet traffic, and of course the carriers themselves. The FCC has done some reporting on this in the United States, and there's some stuff on the FCC website that specifically talks about the changes in traffic patterns in the US. But that information is also being put out by carriers. Vodafone, for example, has put out information about the impact on its network in the UK.
All right, thank you. My apologies to the audience. I'd really meant for Jeff's report to be available to you by time of this, and I just dropped the ball and didn't get that done. But that will be made available to all of you. Roxana, other thoughts on availability of information?
Operators, I will stress that, in some countries, operators are supposed to hand in the information to the regulator, but the regulator should have problems putting the information in order to protect privacy issues, etc., etc. And so maybe with some delay on the websites of regulators, one may be able to get.
All right, so we do have a question about protecting data and protecting privacy. We've talked a lot about the privacy issues, but they're asking specifically what kind of steps might regulators take if you have jurisdiction. If the regulator doesn't have jurisdiction, then maybe the ministry or someone else that does. What kinds of things would you see in place to help protect the data that's being gathered and used at this moment? Jeff, you want to go first on that?
Sure. Well, I think so what's happening here is not that we're collecting more data than we have. We're just realizing it's being collected. So again, I think what I would suggest is really for regulators to be forward-leaning in terms of being part of a conversation, which will vary by country and vary by culture, or vary by politically and culturally. But what are the limits of government use of data? So we've had a debate all over the world about private sector use of data. What can Facebook do? How do we regulate what Facebook does? That, for example, that debate is going on, has been going on. Do you have to read and click on a notice before somebody can place a cookie on your computer so they can show you advertisements you're interested in instead of ones you're less interested in? So we spent a lot of time debating those issues. It's always been true that the more profound issues are the ones that we're really being faced with right now, which is what is government going to use the data for, and to what extent, because there are limits on what private sector entities can use the data for that have been in the law for a long time. And we've had privacy laws for decades going back before the internet, and laws against extortion, for example. So if you're looking at something online that you don't want other people to know that you're looking at, somebody calls you up and says, send me a check or I'll tell other people, that's against the law, has always been against the law. But the ability of the government to collect the kind of ubiquitous data and to use it in an era of big data and artificial intelligence, that's cultural change, that's social change. And so what I'd encourage regulators to do is to think about that and realize that the questions about how governments use this data are now questions that have to be directly confronted and discussed.
Okay. Roxanne, anything to add from your perspective?
We tend to think about those issues, and by we, I mean people in less developed countries, as an issue that we see what the big players do, and so we will discuss around those decisions made. We lack a lot of talent and human capital to address the emergency. And so people are into that, and unfortunately, very few people are talking about those issues, and I think they will turn out to be really important.
Okay. All right, Rebecca, we just have a few minutes left. I've rambled on way too much here. Do you want to see if people are interested in raising their hands and sharing what's going on in their situations?
Definitely. I think we have a good 10 minutes or so where we would love to hear from our audience. If you go to the participant box and select that, you'll have the option to raise your hand. And I would then unmute your audio. And if you would like to share your video, you have that option as well, but that is definitely not required. So if you are interested in talking a little bit more about your own experience with us, I know Roxana and our speakers would love to chime in and just kind of talk with you a little bit about that. We can do that now. And then also,
go ahead.
Sorry, I was going to say while we're waiting I did put it in the group chat, the file for the client alert that Jeff shared, and we'll also send that out with an email.
Okay, thank you. Well, while we're waiting on someone to raise their hand, I have one more question. It's something that you brought up, Jeff, and we should spend more time on it, and we will in future sessions. We'll spend a lot of time on this issue. And that is the investment issue. You said that at least some of the telecom operators in the US are doing fine and going to make the same investments they were going to. We see a lot of other countries around the world where operators are delaying investments. So just from a government perspective, how should you think about and what kind of policies best fit encouraging the investments that are going to need to be made for the future? At some point, if we don't make those investments, the service degrades. What would you suggest that regulators and government officials think about?
Well, I think this is a policy debate that's been going on ever since we as a world moved away from the public utility regulation model for telecoms and began trying to interject competition into the marketplace. So going all the way back to the privatization of nationalized telecom operators and the deregulation of starting with long distance in the United States in the 70s. and 80s, this question of really balancing prices against investment and balancing market structure, considerations around market structure and the role of resellers, MVNOs, CLECs, gone under lots of different names, versus the role of network infrastructure operators. And this is probably not the, we won't resolve that debate on this call for sure. But I do think if there's an upshot from this, the upshot is that the value of robust infrastructure operated by robust infrastructure operators is not something to be taken for granted. So as regulators think about how do I think about this balance between low consumer prices on the one hand and rates of return for infrastructure operators on the other hand, where do I strike the right balance with that? I do think that paying close attention to the robustness of the network it shows itself now as having a public safety element to it that may not have been as apparent a month ago.
Roxana, what are your thoughts? How should governments, regulators look at this investment issue and plan for it?
I think what Jeff just said is like the bottom line. No, you shouldn't take for granted the infrastructure, and less so if you are running a deficit, an infrastructure deficit, which is the case in most developing countries. And so it is really important that those politicians who think, and now you cannot imagine the amount of politicians in Congress saying, hey, we will pardon everybody's debts and expenses, and you shouldn't be paying it like anything. How the amount of harm, how harmful they are to consumers and to quality of service and to the possibilities of the countries to not only survive this emergency, but when there is, when you will be able to plan again, to be able to have a robust economy in order to overcome the hardships that the emergencies brought to people.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much. As I said, we'll get into that some more. We're going to have a panel of some CEOs of some small telecom companies around the world to talk about that issue. And then some of our own per faculty will get into how do you actually do some estimations so you can project what some of the impacts of different policies might be. Rebecca.